Well, thank you for having me. As we go through and talk about this tonight, you'll kind of hear a little bit about kind of how the journey I actually started getting into this. I was an academic for over 20 years, and then I stepped out to run this mental health center and institute. A couple of qualifiers before I start talking. One is, where is mental health in the Bible? But I'm going to kind of fudge it a little bit, and where is mental illness in the Bible? So we're going to look at that. And then the other things of this, why is that even important? Why is it important for us to look at the Bible and try to see if there's mental health problems there and how those people were treated and how that affects their relationship with God and how that might affect how we respond to that? Why is that important? Well, one of the reasons that is important is that today in the United States, a majority of people that have mental health problems, and I mean very serious mental health problems, receive no treatment. You really have to let that sink in. I mean, a majority of people with depression, schizophrenia, these disorders, they don't receive any care here in this country. I mean, if I was saying that about cancer, we'd be rioting in the streets, okay? But there is no other medical condition like that. There's no other one that you can even name in which a majority of the people with the illness do not receive any treatment. Now, there's a lot of reasons why they don't receive treatment. Some has to do with finances, some has to do with the fact that we have just a disaster of a mental health care system that's almost impossible to access. But because of the fact that our system is so dysfunctional, people in psychological distress are more likely to go to a clergy in the United States before they go to a mental health care provider or physician. And what's really interesting about that statistic, which was found by the NIH in large epidemiology studies, is it's not people that are associated with faith communities necessarily, it's anyone. It's not necessarily people that believe in God, it's anyone in the general population is more likely to engage a clergy or a minister before they go to a mental health care provider or physician first. And research that I've done and others have done find that unfortunately the majority of those people are not recognized by that minister or that church as having a mental health care problem, and they do not get referred on to care the way you would hope they would, okay? And then a subset of Christendom, what we find about 30 to 40% of churches, which I know that's really shocking that it's going to be that high, they spiritualize the phenomenon of mental health and basically say, well, if you've got depression, that's just a sin, and you just need to, say, read through the Psalms, which I've actually heard. I'll give you some good quotes from some good pastors in the South as we go through here of things that'll fix mental illness. Read through the Psalms. That'll make your depression go away. Or you need to pray more, or be anxious for nothing. You should never be anxious. And so, again, that's a problem. So if people are more likely to go to faith communities first when they're struggling, they're not being recognized, and a subset are being basically told that they're poor believers because they have a mental health care problem. We have to do better than that, okay? I think it's a divine opportunity that God is sending broken people. I mean, what else? People with cancer don't go to churches first, but people with mental health problems do. It wasn't the church that found that, it was the federal government that found that. So we need to do something about that. So one of the things I think we need to do is I think we need to step back and we need to say, okay, well, does the scripture have something for us in the context of mental health specifically? I mean, obviously in a general sense, we're supposed to take care of those who are suffering and we're called to that kind of a ministry. But what does it specifically say about that? Because I've been telling Brad and others as I've been here today, I've been told some pretty crazy things by pastors in relationship to mental health. You should never be depressed because it says rejoice always. Have you read the rest of the Bible? I mean, that's horrible. Okay, so again, these are horrible misinterpretations of verses, but these damage people. Okay, so what I want to do tonight is I want to ask, what does the Bible say about mental illness? I once had a pastor tell me, and that's where a lot of this revision of this book that I wrote, a lot of the stuff I'll talk about tonight comes from. I had a pastor tell me that he did not believe that mental illness was real because he wasn't in the Bible. He said that to me. It's not in the Bible. Now what he meant was it didn't say mental illness in the Bible. But I took that to really start to kind of think and say, well, I mean, is it in the Bible? I mean, what does it say in the Bible? Were these things that occurred in that time? Obviously, they didn't see them in the same way. So we'll talk about that as we go through. So is it in the Bible? So let's begin. They're in the Bible, and I use a lot of, I do sometimes use the deuterocanonical text, which is what you might think of as the Apocrypha. And the reason I look at that too is because that was written in that era. And it gives us an idea at least of how they perceived these types of behaviors and stuff. So I might make reference to that time. Don't freak out or anything. And I'm not Catholic or Episcopalian or whatever. It's okay. It's okay to read a little Tobit now and then if you haven't ever read that. So, all right, so there are 32 references if you count the 5 that are in the deuterocanonical text. And, these are references to madness or insanity. Now, what are they making reference to? They're probably making reference to what we would think of as psychosis, something extreme, okay? They're not saying, oh, well, Sarah, Abraham's wife, was really, she went into a depressive episode. They're not talking about that. They're talking about an extreme behavior, okay? They're talking about something that would have been recognized by people around them. So it's referenced several times in the scripture, at least, if you just count the Old Testament and the New Testament, you're looking at, 27 times. So obviously something referred to as madness. They're not going to break it down into different types of illnesses. There is no reference to the brain in the entire Bible. Not even a veiled reference, okay? They didn't know what the brain was. In fact, the term brain comes from probably a word that was made more of a reference to a fatty substance. That most people didn't. Even Aristotle thought the brain was a radiator that cooled your body. He didn't realize. He thought you thought with your heart, literally. So, and he was a pretty smart guy. So, what is this they're talking about here? If we look at 1 Samuel, and this is one of my favorite verses that I have, these pastors that tell me, well, it's not in there, I think it's sin, I will say, okay, well, let's go to 1 Samuel. Now, in 1 Samuel, David is hiding in the Philistine land from Saul, and he decides to go hide with the king there. And obviously, Philistines probably aren't real happy to see David. They have to be careful of him. He's killed a whole lot of them. And so he gets nervous that he's going to, something bad's going to happen. So it says he feigns insanity. Okay, he starts to drool on himself, and he starts to either write on the wall or scratch on the wall. And there's in kind of the Septuagint, it suggests he's flailing his arms around, that he is acting in a way that they recognize. He's not saying anything. They recognize it as madness. And then the king's like, why are you bringing this guy to me? Don't I have enough mad people around here already? I don't want him around here if he's like this. So they don't see him as a threat because he's mad. But this is the most important part of it. You can't fake something that people recognize if it doesn't exist. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, you can't act something out without saying anything and have other people recognize it unless it's common. So if I acted like a monkey up here, okay, you all have either seen a picture of a monkey or a video of a monkey or a real monkey. And you would say, first, I was probably crazy, and then you would say, he's acting like a monkey, right? Well, you wouldn't be able to guess that I was acting like a monkey unless you'd seen a monkey, right? So this was common and recognizable. Now, again, I imagine this is probably psychosis or some kind of serious cognitive deficit where the person's acting. But that being said, it was occurring in those ancient times, okay? So what we then can ask ourselves, since we can be pretty confident that it was occurring, well, how were these people treated? How were they viewed? What were the views of the people of the time on why this happened? Because remember, they have no concept of the brain, and they certainly have no concept of psychology and the way we talk about it today. So what was it that they thought was happening to these individuals? So they took a solely spiritual basis. Now, that's a very Eastern mindset, which is great, but it's also, we'll talk a little bit later about kind of a pre-scientific. They don't think like we do. I mean, they weren't thinking like we do. It's not that their thinking was wrong. They just simply don't think the way we think about things. In the Old Testament, it's clear that madness was considered, if it occurred, it was considered a divine punishment. And you can see that from Deuteronomy, where it said, when you violate the covenant, this is what's going to happen. The Lord's going to afflict you with madness and blindness and confusion of mind. I mean, they struggled with understanding that. And the idea that, well, if I see someone who's mad, does that mean that God is punishing them? Well, they went with that. Okay, so if you were in the Old Testament and you had madness, you were not seen as a righteous individual that was right with God. You were under divine punishment, as you were probably if you had just about any kind of physical ailment or any kind of disability. You were under divine punishment and you were unrighteous. And many of those people weren't allowed to go into the temple. Many of those people weren't allowed to be involved in certain ceremonies and rituals because they were considered unclean. So in the Old Testament, divine punishment. By the time we get to Jesus' day, okay, in the first century, we still see madness as a spiritual cause, but now it's demonic. Okay, it's not really a divine punishment as much as the individual who's mad is possessed by a demon. Okay, so it's still spiritual in nature, but it's demonic, and we're going to look at some examples of that in just a minute. But what's interesting about this, and probably what's been most interesting to me as I've gone through and done this work, and I'm doing another book right now that's looking at children's disorders, so I've been looking at some other things in the text, is that's still the problem that we have in the church today, is that I've had both of those told to me by pastors that said that's why people have mental health problems. So, I mean, 4,000 years, I mean, we haven't really come that far, you know, I mean, so it's amazing. In the church, there's still people that look at this as divine punishment. There's still people that look at this as demonic. And I believe in the demonic, okay? I'm not saying that I don't believe in the demonic. I'm just saying that we treat mental health problems in a very different way. I've been in churches where people with mental health problems were suggested to have demonic issues, but when people had cancer, no one suggested that there might be cancer that was demonic. I mean, in the Bible, the demonic caused people to have boils and back problems and mutism, and I mean, you can go through a whole string of things. Same thing with divine punishment, but those other things never have moved to the today where people say, oh, well, you have a back problem, well, that's just a messenger of Satan. You know, like Jesus said, you know, when the lady comes and he's the one who says that. So that doesn't happen, but with mental health problems, it does. So how are they treated? Can we glean that from the text? I mean, they're mentioned in there, and I think we can because there's some really interesting text in there, and there's some interesting things that we have to think about what we do in the context of mental health problems. So for first, they were clearly feared. If you look at, say, Jeremiah 29, which is this actual verse right here, the Lord has appointed you priests in place of Jediah to be in charge of the house of the Lord. You should put any maniac who acts like a prophet into the stocks and neck irons. Okay, so there's in the ancient Hebrew culture, acting euphoric and ecstatic and extreme was really equated with being a prophet. Prophets acted that way, but so did crazy people that were insane, as they would say, and you had to differentiate them. And if you found the maniac, you were to put them in irons. You were to chain them up. And if you look at, say, Mark 5, that's the Gadarene demonic. That's when Jesus, Legion, that's right, most people remember it, when Jesus goes across and he comes across the one man and I guess Matthew and then two in the other. But they're out in the cemetery, and it says at one time he had been chained, so they had tried to chain him. I mean, you don't chain people up unless you're afraid of them, okay? I mean, that's just a fact. You just don't chain people up unless you're afraid of them. So here's two references to people that are acting extreme and out of control like that are said to be chained up in some way. So they were clearly feared. Are people with mental illness still feared today? Yes. Very much so. I mean, all you got to do is click the news on. I mean, they've convinced us that we're going to get shot up by somebody who's mentally ill all the time. Although people with mental illness are no more likely than the general population to be aggressive. I mean, that's just a fact. There's research on that. But why would we report that? That's not important. So, stigmatize and shame. They use pejorative references in the Bible in relationship to people who are mentally ill. Or so like that would be like if I said to you, oh, you're crazy. Now, you don't take that as a negative. You know I'm saying that what you're saying is extreme and I don't believe it. But that's an insult to people that are mentally ill. Or maybe better if I said, oh, you're such a retard. You ever heard like a kid say that? Like that really bothers me because I have a cousin who is intellectually disabled, and sometimes my kids will say that. They don't say it very often, but just occasionally, and I get really upset. Okay, but the thing is, we hear those terms, right? Those are negative or pejorative terms. Well, in Acts 12:15, it's Rhoda, the slave girl, right? Peter's at the door, right? He's supposed to be in jail, but he's at the door knocking, and she says, he's at the door knocking, and they say, you're out of your mind. Well, now, why would you say you're out of your mind to somebody who said something to you? It's because whatever they said, you don't believe and you think it's too extreme and it's wrong. It's a negative. The same thing with Acts 26. That's when Paul is before Festus or Felix, and he says, your great learning has made you crazy. You're out of your mind. Nobody rises from the dead. Again, it's a negative reference to people. If you're making negative references to people that are mad, they must be pretty commonplace, and people must know what they're like, and they must not be looked upon very highly. They're shamed. Okay, there's a stigma. We do the same thing today. Okay, so saying you're nuts, like, hey, you're nuts. Again, that's a pejorative reference to mental illness. So that's in the text as well. So you see that in there. And then finally, what I mentioned before, there's just no doubt that these individuals were seen as unrighteous or separate from God. The Gadarene demonic, the punishment that's going to occur both in Deuteronomy and Zechariah that God's going to bring upon you for breaking the covenant. I mean, John 10:19, we're going to look at Jesus as example. Did you know that Jesus on multiple occasions was accused of being both insane and possessed by a demon at the same time? They're equal. They're in essence used interchangeably in making reference to him. So if we use Jesus' example, 4 occasions here, 3 in John and 1 in Mark, he is accused of being possessed by a demon, and 2 of those references, they actually interchangeably use the concept that he's insane. But if you read the text, if you read what he's doing, you understand that what they are saying every time is that he's insane and that he's possessed by a demon. And the reason they're saying that is what I said before. In the first century, if you were insane, you were possessed by a demon, because that's what caused madness. So what he's saying is so extreme to them, they simply can't put it into context, okay? And so in the Mark verse, this is where his family goes to get him. It says they were saying he's out of his mind, and the scribes came down from Jerusalem saying he's possessed by Beelzebub and by the prince of demons. He has an unclean spirit. Now this is Jesus, the rabbi, the teacher. They're in essence equating the idea that he's mad or out of his mind with being possessed. And his family is so concerned about what they hear, they go to get him. They're going to go get him and take care of him. This is also where in another version of that you hear Jesus say, well, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? They never can get in because the crowd is around him. In John, the crowd, Jesus is talking to them about being the Messiah, and he says, and you want to kill me? And they say, you have a demon. Who wants to kill you? They didn't want to kill. This crowd right here did not actually want to kill him. So that when he's saying those things, they think he must be insane. He must have a demon. My favorite one, the John 8, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? I mean, it's the ultimate insult to the first century, to a Jew, right? You're a half-breed and you have a demon. So again, you could see also, now we know that you have a demon, because this is, again, he's saying things that are so extreme to them, they just simply cannot conceptualize them or understand them. And then finally, the John 10, the Jews heard these words again and were divided. Many said, he is possessed and is raving mad. Why would you listen to him? So Jesus himself is accused many times of being insane and having a demon. So we see that he's actually one of the better examples in the text of someone who says some extreme things, and then those individuals that are hearing that say, he's mad. He must have a demon. And those are the same thing to them. Having a demon and being mad, it's the same thing. They don't equate it as they're not thinking of it as much of a spiritual sense as we would. When we say someone has a demon, we're thinking of that in a very spiritual sense. In this instance, they're trying to kind of make out, why is this person mad? This is the reason. I might say this person has schizophrenia, and that means they have this dopamine dysfunction. And within their understanding, this person's mad, and they have a demon. That's why they have a demon. So if we want to help them, it would be some type of exorcism or something like that. In this instance, they're really negating what Jesus is saying. He can't be legit. He can't be the Messiah. These can't be truths from God because this man is just so extreme, he's mad. So, that being said, we can go through and we can find these references. Certainly it's easy to go through and find a bunch of references on madness. It's a little bit more difficult perhaps to kind of make some of the inferences and find a pejorative reference and things like that. But nothing that I've done is really particularly difficult. It's all right there. For a pastor to tell me that it's not in there means that in essence he really never looked. Because it's obviously, at least something like psychosis is there, and Jesus himself is being accused of being mad. So, they knew what madness was. But would it be possible, or is it possible, for us to look into the text, look at people that perhaps weren't described as mad, or even were described as mad, and look at their behaviors and their thought patterns and the way other people saw them, and look at that in a modern context? I'm not saying that these people necessarily had these disorders. What I'm saying is that could we kind of pull out of that world, what would we have said about that person? What would we have said that person was struggling with at the time? Would that help us understand the story more? Would that help us understand the individual more? Now, today we use the Diagnostic and Statistical manual, and here's all of the ones, all the ones that have existed. This is our new one, DSM-5, and each mental illness has a set of criteria, and it usually has some kind of a historical sense, and that you have to have existed for at least 6 months, or this long, or that long. So there's a set of fairly specific criteria that have to be used. Now, obviously, we don't have the opportunity to interview these people. We don't have the opportunity to get a lot of additional information. But there are a lot of people in the Bible that have a lot of problems. Okay, there's no doubt about that. And that's the beauty of the Bible. It's warts and all. Okay, it isn't if you look at other texts from other faiths or other holy books, they're cleaned up. These are mystical characters that have no problems, that never get into conflict. The Bible's full of messy, messy people. And what the Bible is great is it's not only full of messy people, but it's many different types of literature. It's historical narrative, and it's prose, and it's poems, and it's individuals thinking, like with David writing his Psalms. You have a lot of different kind of information. So you have a lot of, and then you have wonderful things like the Gospels, which are different people's view of the same event, which really gives you, because what do we do in psychology and psychiatry? We sit down with a person, we interview them, then we go interview their family members, then we have their teacher fill out a form, and then we get information from different places. And I will tell you that when I go through and I look at a story in the text, I also try to find additional information. So for instance, I might use the Deuterocanonical text and see if that person's been referenced there. I might look at the Talmud, which is a Jewish commentary on the Old Testament, or I might look at the Midrash, or I might look at or Josephus, which is he's a historian, Roman Jewish historian. These are a third-party kind of things. It doesn't mean that they were there, but it does give you an idea of how people at that time thought about what was happening and the behaviors how they would describe what they were seeing. So here are the problems with doing that. Just a few, okay? There are many, okay? One, these people had absolutely, in the Bible, no understanding or recognition of the brain whatsoever. So you have to understand, when they're describing something, they're not trying to describe behavior that is... They actually thought you actually had thought more out of your kidneys than you did anything. Okay, in fact, the Talmud talks about you have one evil kidney and one good kidney. So good behavior, bad behavior. When David writes that you've knit me together in my inmost being, it's really your kidneys that you kind of knit together. That's what he's really talking about. So there's lots of kidneys and livers and intestines and all kind of, but no brain. So obviously their descriptions would be changed by that in some sense. They're pre-scientific in their thinking. That doesn't make them stupid. That just makes them think in a very different way than we do. In fact, sometimes I wish I could think that way, okay? Because we overanalyze everything. Everything is analyzed to us. We got to kind of figure it out. We think in a scientific kind of way because we have exposure to technology and all types of things. They didn't think like that. In fact, they thought in a much simpler and a much more spiritual way than we think. They were much quicker to look for a spiritual cause or associate things with spiritual matters or move towards the spiritual than we are. We're much more likely to say, let me figure it out. Okay, well, maybe it was spiritual because I don't really think I can figure this out, kind of thing. Translation and language issues, you know, I've probably, in my office, I probably have, you know, 5 to 10 different versions of the Bible. You know, ESV, NASB, NIV. Okay, those are just that, let alone the fact that, you know, you go and look at ones that were written in Greek versus the texts that were in Hebrew versus, I mean, there's just so much going on. Plus, they're speaking a different language, and then that's now been translated into English, and I'm trying to look at that and try to get a sense of the behaviors that they're describing. Now, I'm using, you know, concordances and things like that to look at the Hebrew and the Greek and the Aramaic and trying to get a sense of what they really meant. But even then, I'm certainly separated significantly from them, and I have to understand that. Cultural differences are obvious. Religious differences are obvious. I'm not an ancient Jew, you know, a Hebrew. Interpretation bias. If I go into the text looking for something, I'm going to find it. I got to tell myself that. I know that's going to happen. So I got to keep telling myself, you're not seeing what you think you're seeing. It's not there. I actually have to convince myself. It will take me to look at one story, to go through and look. It'll take me weeks to months sometimes to ultimately decide that indeed it really does meet the criteria. The other thing is that's nice about, for instance, with this, is we have a set of criteria that we can lay it out by. So if I can write those criteria out, I better find the same criteria in some way to justify that. So that's another thing that we're able to do. Now, that being said, who do you think in the Bible, Old or New Testament, is the one character that more psychologists and psychiatrists have written about as having a mental illness than any other character, with no close second? Who do you think the most common one is? David. Not David.
Ezekiel.
Not Ezekiel, though there's some. Nebuchadnezzar sometimes, but yes, not in him. Saul, King Saul. And I mean, I could bring a stack of papers in here of psychiatrists and psychologists. I mean, think about it for a minute. The guy has his rages. In fact, why is David even brought in? He's brought in to basically do music therapy with the guy, right? When David plays his harp, Saul becomes calm, okay? He tries to pin David to the wall with a spear. I mean, he's got real paranoia issues. I mean, he hunts the guy for how long? I mean, so there's a lot going on there, okay? So these are going to be a little bit difficult for you to see as I go through, but I've gone through, at this point, given these books and the other one, and I can pretty much identify individuals that show all of these in the text, okay? So I'm going to talk about a few of them today, but they're in there, okay? Now, they're not described the way that I might describe them if I had a client today, but all of the criteria are listed out. So, I mean, it's a very interesting thing to go through and look at that. So now let's, we can see it better than I thought. Here is King Saul. Okay, so now, more often than not, and I agree with this, more often than not it's suggested that Saul has bipolar disorder. Okay, now, when I say that, some people might feel very nervous because believe me, I've said things in talks like this that made people really nervous. So, and why would someone feel nervous if I said Saul had a mental illness?
They might have the same illness.
Because what?
They might have the same illness.
That's possible. But what's something in the story that would make you maybe think that maybe it wasn't a mental illness? An evil spirit. That's exactly right. Because once God removes his spirit from Saul, remember when Saul is disobedient and he makes the sacrifice and he does what he's not supposed to do, God's punishment is that he removes his spirit from Saul, and now Saul's kingdom days are numbered. And then, it isn't the evil spirit that's the punishment. Sometimes we confuse that. But it says an evil spirit comes and torments him, and he'll rage during those times. So we might look at that and we might say, well, it can't be a mental illness then because there's an evil spirit involved. And I would say I'm not sure why that is necessarily true. Because maybe evil spirit's involved and it causes him to kind of look like he has a mental health problem. Or maybe he has a mental health problem and the evil spirit is taking advantage of that. There's a lot of options that you have other than just to say, I deny that an evil spirit exists, which I don't. And some people have gone as far to say, well, since these are pre-scientific thinkers, everyone in the Bible that has an evil spirit is really mentally ill. And they just didn't understand. And I would never go that far. I don't believe that. I think the problem with that is that, and we'll see one in a minute that I'll show you, that calls into question Jesus' divinity, I think, because in several instances, Jesus says, this person has an evil spirit, and he casts that evil spirit out. And I think that would really, I've been debating back and forth with a couple people, kind of playing devil's advocate. What if Jesus knew they didn't have an evil spirit, but he just didn't want to freak people out? He wanted them to, you know what I'm saying, like they thought it did. So that would be deceptive. And I think deception would be hard to not be sinful. So I think that people get nervous. But let's look at Saul here. If we go through and look at some of the things. To have bipolar disorder, according to the Diagnostics manual, you have to have both depressive episodes and at least one manic episode. And a manic episode is a euphoric, ecstatic level of arousal in which you may even become psychotic. Depressive episode is a little bit more easy for people just to understand a depressed mood, but extreme. And so what you see with Saul, and these JAs, well, that doesn't point on there. The JA is a reference to Josephus, which is a historian that writes about what things that were going on in the Bible at the time. And so he has a number of things. He has these prophetic frenzies. Something you don't realize until you really sit down and start reading the text. You remember when Saul first is anointed, he goes out and he finds these prophets and he has this prophetic experience. And that's where this saying comes in the Bible. It says, is Saul now among the prophets? Well, we then kind of lazily think that every time he has a prophetic experience, it's like that first one where the Spirit is clearly involved. It isn't, because there are times where it says he's in his home prophesying that he tries to pin David to the wall with a spear. Because the way the term that they're using that they translate as prophesy is just really this ecstatic, euphoric experience, okay? Now remember that Jeremiah verse. Prophets and maniacs can look just alike, okay? And so there's another time that he prophesies, he strips all his clothes off and he lays naked in front of Samuel for a couple of days. I don't think that was the Spirit. It just doesn't seem like the Spirit. It seems like almost like a delusional, psychotic experience. And so he has several of those. He's homicidal at times. He's trying to pin David to the wall. He builds a monument to himself. He has this inflated self-esteem. He's paranoid of David to the extreme. He's out hunting him when there's really no reason for him to be doing that. Josephus talks about he has these experiences, that Saul had experiences that he was so overcome by a feeling that he felt like he was suffocating. A panic attack. Okay, I mean, it's an interesting added in, it's not in the biblical text. Josephus talks about it when he's talking about the story of Saul. But that was something that was known in the legend, in the historical understanding of what he experienced. And so you find some really interesting things. With major depressive episodes, it talks many times about him being filled with depression and fear. He gives extremely foolish orders, like the foolish order in the context of problems with concentration and indecisiveness. At that one point, he says, anybody that eats is going to be put to death. And who eats? Jonathan. So, I mean, he makes these ridiculous kind of decisions. He has feelings of worthlessness. And this is really interesting. If you think about, again, this is why sometimes you start to kind of look at the text and something you always wondered about always all of a sudden makes sense. He was hiding in the baggage, remember? But the text also describes him as head and shoulders taller than every other man in Israel. He was the man's man, and he's hiding in the baggage. Well, why would he be hiding in the baggage? Could it be that he had feelings of worthlessness, or he really had a low sense of self-esteem and was devalued? Well, from a depressive perspective, that makes perfect sense. I've seen clients like that. They on the outside look perfect, like everything's great. On the inside, they are so undervalued in worth to themselves that they would never be able to go through with that. So this, he had a change in appetite, talks about that. He has strange guilt over the pursuit of David. Remember how he pursued David and he wants to kill him, but then all of a sudden I'm so sorry, I shouldn't do that. That was bad. David, you are my servant. And then he goes right back to hunting him again. It's kind of this back and forth. Some of this stuff doesn't make any sense unless you put it in the context of someone really struggling. So overall, also the really interesting part, I think, is where he goes to the witch of Endor and he hears the voice of Samuel. No one else in that interaction seems to hear that voice. And the other thing is God had refused to speak to Saul. He was no longer speaking to Saul. And so Saul is desperate. He goes to the witch of Endor. I wonder if he really heard the voice. I wonder if he was so out of it already, and it's the next day that he commits suicide during the battle. Did he really hear the voice of Samuel? What's the theology behind God allowing Samuel to speak to Saul from the dead? I mean, I don't know that isn't true. I'm just wondering, did he actually hear the voice? So he's very much struggling. And that's, like I said, I'm not the first person to ever write about him. A stack of psychologists and psychiatrists have written about him as the one that's the most disturbed in the scriptures. Now, they also all just minimize the idea of an evil spirit. I think an evil spirit could certainly, and I talk about that in one of the books, certainly cause an infirmity. The Bible clearly says that. So could an evil spirit cause a mental health problem? Absolutely. I think the problem for us today is, can we differentiate a mental health problem caused by the demonic and a mental health problem that's organic? And what I would say is, I don't know that we need to, because I pray for my clients against the demonic, and I pray for my clients for healing, and I pursue treatment in the natural, psychotherapy and medication. Why would I? God's provided all that opportunity. Why would I not do that? And if I pray against the demonic and they're instantaneously healed, well, then we don't have to do anything else. But if I pray against the demonic and they're still struggling, it's probably not the demonic. And I keep praying for healing like the persistent widow, because God certainly heals. But I think more often than not, it's kind of the exception than the rule. Miraculous healings don't happen every minute of the day. But hey, I'll pray and pray and pray and pray and pray to the very end. And then medication and psychotherapy. God's provided those things as well. So I think God's a God of healing. And if you get better from your strep throat by taking amoxicillin, God healed you. Period. That's just how it is. He provided the amoxicillin, but he also willed that you be healed in that instance. So I don't really see the distinction there. I think these things go together very, very well. And so if we look at somebody like Saul, I think, we'll be able to learn a lot from him. At the end, I'm going to kind of come back and talk about kind of what we learned from that. I'm going to, just so I can leave a few minutes for questions, I'm going to just kind of jump through a few of these. Just really quickly, talk about David as a nice example of depression. I don't think anybody's shocked by that. I mean, the majority of David's Psalms are Psalms of lament. We like to think about him dancing before the ark in his underwear, that he's all happy all the time, and that he killed the giant. I mean, he's a myth. David is a strange character because we have mythologized him to the point that he really isn't even a real person anymore. But he is, he's an incredible individual, but he's also a murderer. We all know that. He's also an adulterer. He also is a horrible father, horrible. But that being said, God used him powerfully. And he was a man after God's own heart, even though he had all those warts. You can go through David, because we have the Psalms that he wrote, he basically lays out all the criteria for depression for us. He talks it constantly about it. And what's so interesting about David is in a time before there was ever any treatment for depression or an opportunity to really even understand it, you see his Psalms where he finds relief in his faith. You know, he talks about, oh God, how long will this go on? You're breaking my bones, da 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 da. And then right in the middle of the Psalm, but this I bring to mind. This I remember. This I know to be true. I mean, he finds relief in that. And I think that is something that we can give, to people today. We can show them the truths of God, that they do bring relief. They may not bring complete curative aspect of the disorder, but they certainly can build a foundation for healing. So I will tell you, I'm just going to jump through this one real quick. If you go to Psalm 55, 4 and 5, it's basically, the two lines basically describe a panic attack that he has. It talks about his heart pounding in his chest and stuff. And depression and anxiety go hand in hand. And so it's a pretty interesting verse in the context of a panic attack. And it just kind of reiterates the idea that David may have struggled with some depression and anxiety, which isn't surprising. In fact, I'll just give you one little taste of that. You ever wonder why, it said, in a time when kings go out to war, David stayed home. Remember that? And then what happens next? Bathsheba is bathing on the roof, right? And he sees her. Now, there's also a part right there that says he can't sleep, so he's out walking around on the roof. Well, what's a common symptom of depression? He can't sleep. Insomnia. And why did David not go out to war? David was the greatest warrior there was. So the thing is that could David have been in a depressive episode? He's not feeling well, he's down, he has insomnia, and then he chooses a negative coping strategy to try to deal with, which is still used today very commonly. Sex, promiscuity is still very commonly used to try to make people feel better when they're struggling with issues. Is it possible that's what happened? That in no way minimizes the spiritual aspect of that story. In fact, to me, it makes it more real. To me, it makes me be able to relate to David in a way that I don't see him as a mythological character. In fact, I even see it even in a greater sense, God uses broken people that are struggling. And so I wanted to mention this. This is the Gadarene demonic. You know that story. This is Legion. Legion, clearly, if you want to go through and look at the criteria, could be described as a schizophrenic. Okay? But I think what's more interesting, perhaps, is that if you look at the Talmud, which is, again, a commentary by Jewish rabbis written between 200 and 500 AD of the Old Testament, they actually lay out the criteria for what they consider people who are mad. Okay? And these are the four criteria. Go out unaccompanied at night, sleep in cemeteries, tear their gardens or go naked, lose everything that's given to them. It's strikingly similar to the description of the man that Jesus meets in that cemetery. He's naked, he's cutting himself. It's interesting that, so if you put it in the context of that first century, they would have considered him mad and demon possessed. That's how they would have thought of him. And so it in no way minimizes the fact that Jesus cast a demon out of him or that a demon was causing his infirmity. It gives us a better idea of how they would have perceived that individual. But I do think he had a psychotic disorder. I think in this instance, it was demon generated. And I think to say that it wasn't would mean that I basically said that Jesus either lied or didn't understand that it wasn't. And I do believe that it was demon generated. I'm not sure that if I had met the Gadarene demonic, I would have been able to differentiate that from schizophrenia. Do you know what I'm saying? So I would have done my 3-part approach to treatment. I would have prayed against the demonic, I would have prayed for healing, I would have pursued treatment in the natural. We tend to focus on the pigs in that story. We kind of miss all the other stuff, So this is the one I wanted to really talk about last, and then I'll end up. Suicide. I have been called into lots of churches, lots of small groups, and lots of Christian organizations because somebody in that or group organization died by suicide. And the first question that I've been asked so many times that it's frightening is, where is our friend? Is he in hell because he committed suicide? There was a time that the Catholic Church taught that it was a mortal sin to commit suicide. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, they both had written about this. And they felt it was a reasoned decision, and they thought it was a sin for someone to commit suicide. Whether it's a sin or not, we're complete in Christ and we have forgiveness, and you're not held accountable for a single act in your whole life puts you in hell kind of thing if you know the Lord. But again, it's a question people ask. And I would usually say, I got to the point where I would say, well, I'm going to answer your question with a question. Where is Samson today? Samson is listed out in the Hebrews 11, roll call of faith with all the other greats, okay? So he's listed out. So I would say pretty good bet would be that Samson was righteous and that he's probably in heaven with God right now, okay? But Samson clearly killed himself. There's no doubt about it. He knew what he was doing, and he killed himself. In fact, strangely, God's a little complicit in that too. He kind of gives him the power back to do it. God knew what he was going to do, but we won't go there because that'll make you throw things at me. So the thing is that he clearly kills himself. Now that may be different than somebody who dies as a result of suicide. 90% plus of people with mental health problems, 90% plus of people who die by suicide are struggling with a mental health problem at the time of their death. So suicide is really, it's the terminal aspect of mental illness, okay? But there are a lot of people that have suicidal ideations in the Bible. There's a whole lot of them. There's some listed ones there. I got some deuterocanonical people in there too. But there's also a lot of suicides in the Bible. And I really kind of break them up into three sections or three types. There's heroic martyrdom, which I would consider Samson. That's heroic martyrdom. He sacrificed himself to kill the Philistines. But he did know what he was doing, and he did know he was going to die. Okay? So if killing yourself, if doing something to kill yourself sends you to hell, then Samson would be in hell. But obviously, he isn't in hell. I think there's battle conflict-related suicides, and Saul is a good example of that in his armor bearer. He kills himself so he won't be captured. I mean, even his body is desecrated after, even when they find his dead body, it's desecrated. So you can't imagine what they would have done to him. So there's a number of those that occur. And then there's personal distress, which is what we think of as today as suicide most often is personal distress. Although there are people that do those other things. Think about the Buddhist monk that sets himself on fire. He does that to make a protest kind of thing. That would fall under heroic martyrdom, kind of type of killing like that. Now, look at these people right here. Because of this last guy right here, that's why suicide's looked at as a sin, is because of Judas. Because when you ask people, tell me somebody in the Bible killed themselves, Judas Iscariot, bad guy, bad all around, right? So, he hangs himself. There's some other examples of hanging, poisoning. There's a wonderful evisceration in 2 Maccabees where a guy cuts his guts open and throws them at the people that are coming after him to try to... There's some great stuff in there. I mean, it's really interesting. So, but I list all this out for this. There's not a single person that's listed there that was either a good guy or a bad guy when they were alive in which the biblical text says anything negative about their suicide or their death. Not a single one. Now, isn't that interesting? Wouldn't you think it would say, and Zimri was separate from the Lord because he killed himself? Wouldn't you like a final statement? In fact, most of them say stuff like, and Zimri was buried with his fathers, which is an honor, okay? If they were a bad guy when they were alive, they were thought of as a bad guy after they died. If they were a good guy when they were alive, they were described as a good guy after they're dead. So there's nothing in the text that suggests that. Now, what Augustine, what his deal was, he said it was a violation of you shouldn't murder. And Thomas Aquinas said that you were trying to take away God's ability to give life and take life. So, I mean, they're not even looking at the people that actually committed suicide. So it's just interesting to look at that. So now I have a whole lot of information to give to those Bible studies in those churches, and I'll go through this whole chapter and I'll just say, look, let's look at this. What does the Bible say? So what do we learn from all of this? I mean, what do we learn from going through and look at these? I mean, like I said, there's psychotic disorders there. There's substance use. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in the Bible. So what do we learn? Well, number one, we learned that madness was present and known in biblical times. So that's probably the least important. But for me, it was important because I had somebody tell me it wasn't in there. And it is in there. It's clearly in there. A blind man could see that it's in there, okay? It's in there, all right? Secondly, mental illness is not a mark of spiritual weakness, nor does it disqualify us from a relationship or service to God. I mean, Saul was a great king for the first half of his reign. In fact, he was as good, if not better, of a king as David for the first half of his reign. David is a man after God's own heart. I mean, I can go through a whole set of people that I talk about in the book or that have problems that they were wonderfully spiritual people that sought out God, as are most of the clients that I work with. They are desperately seeking out a relationship with God and healing. So it isn't some kind of disqualifying. Wouldn't there be some reference that said, and, Jedediah was mad and separate from God because of it? Do you know what I mean? There's nothing like that in the text. God is actively pursuing those in the midst of mental illness. Someone mentioned Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar has boanthropy or lycanthropy, which is where he thinks he's an animal. It still happens today in a lot of third world countries. People become delusional and think they're an animal. Okay, obviously God caused that, but God was pursuing that pagan king. He used that to draw him to him. I mean, you see that in the text. Okay, Jesus traveled across the water to meet the Gadarene demonic. I mean, I think his steps were very purposeful. I don't think he just kind of happened upon people. I mean, he's actively pursuing people that are struggling. Mental illness can be a transformative experience. It draws one closer to God. Certainly, Nebuchadnezzar's illness was, and as were many others. The presence of mental illness does not alter or thwart the perfect purpose or plan of God for a person's life. David's a perfect example of that. God had an incredible plan for his life, and despite the fact that he clearly is struggling with depression for most of his reign, that purpose is fulfilled. And he's a man after God's own heart. Jesus personally experienced and understood the stigma associated with madness. I mean, 4 times that we have reference to. I promise you it happened a lot more. We have reference to it 4 times he's referred to as demon-possessed and mad. I mean, that's a powerful message to somebody who's stigmatized by a Christian who's been stigmatized by the church, who's struggling to understand that, to show them that Jesus himself was stigmatized, was thought to be mad because of what he was saying. I mean, that's a powerful message for them. And in Christ, we have a hope that transcends circumstances, which is the great foundation for recovery from these illnesses. That's the beauty of being a psychologist that works in a faith-based environment. You have a hope that transcends circumstances that you can give to your clients. Otherwise, the hope is that your therapeutic intervention will minimize their symptoms. I've worked with plenty of clients that they may have better quality of life, but their symptoms didn't change all that much. I mean, they struggled. I work with the sickest of the sick, schizophrenia, bipolar with psychotic features. We work with very, very ill people. But to be able to give them a hope that transcends their circumstances, a hope that goes beyond this life and continues, really does build a foundation for recovery. And so I think that's really something that we can learn here. And I think many of these examples are that way. They, in the midst of their struggles, they look to God to allow them to be able to move forward.